The rusty hinges of the cabin door screeched as Itzel Blackthorne stepped onto the rotting porch, her 8-month-old daughter Iris crying in her arms and 8-year-old Timothy clinging to her worn coat. Behind them, the entire Blackthorne family stood in a semicircle like vultures, their expensive cars parked on the dirt road. Roderick Blackthorne, her late husband's older brother, threw his head back in laughter. "Look at this palace, everyone. Our dear sister-in-law's grand inheritance." Cordelia Blackthorne, Garrett's sister, adjusted her designer sunglasses and sniffed the damp air with distaste. $1 whole worth of luxury living. Maybe you can rent it out for 50 cents a night. The family erupted in cruel laughter as baby Iris wailed louder, disturbed by the harsh sounds. Itzel pressed her lips together, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She'd spent the last of her savings on plane tickets to England after their family lawyer had informed her of her inheritance, believing there must have been some mistake. Now she realized the mistake had been hers, expecting decency from people who had none. Young Timothy tugged at his mother's sleeve, his small face confused as he pointed through the mountain mist. "Mama, whose castle is that?" In the distance, barely visible through low-hanging clouds, sat a magnificent structure with towering spires and ancient stone walls, a stark contrast to the dilapidated cabin. Marcus Blackthorne, the youngest brother, followed the boy's gaze and snorted. "That's Ravenscroft Castle, kid. Belongs to some rich English lord who abandoned it decades ago. Maybe your mommy can wave at it from her mansion here." More laughter echoed across the valley. "We've arranged for the utilities to be connected," Roderick added. "Consider it our housewarming gift. The cabin has been sitting empty since our grandfather bought this land in the 50s. He never could sell it. Something about encumbrances on the deed. Whatever that means. We should go if we want to make our flight. The lawyers have handled all the paperwork. The cabin is officially yours. Itzel. Enjoy your new kingdom, Your Majesty," Roderick called out as they piled back into their luxury vehicles. The convoy of cars disappeared down the mountain road. Itzel stood alone with her children, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. The enormity of her situation crashed down upon her shoulders. She was in a foreign country with 2 small children, almost no money, and nowhere else to go. She pushed open the cabin door. Surprisingly, it was solid oak, despite its appearance, moving heavily on hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through broken windows, revealing a space that was both better and worse than she'd expected. "At least it's dry," she murmured, setting Iris's carrier down on what appeared to be the cleanest patch of floor. The baby had finally stopped crying and was blinking curiously at her new surroundings. The main room was larger than expected, with a massive stone fireplace that seemed oddly grand for such a humble dwelling. "It's like a pioneer house from my history book," Timothy observed. He ran his small hand along the wooden wall. "But super old." Itzel set to work immediately, finding an old broom in a corner and attacking the cobwebs that hung from the ceiling like lace curtains. Timothy helped by picking up debris and carrying it outside. Together, they managed to clear enough space in the main room to lay out their sleeping bags. "There's a pump out back, Mama," Timothy called out. "And it works. I got water." Small mercies, Itzel thought. At least they wouldn't die of thirst. As evening approached, she focused on making the fireplace usable. Despite the spring season, the English countryside grew chilly at night. She found some dry wood stacked in a lean-to shed and soon had a small fire crackling in the hearth. Timothy explored while Iris slept in her carrier. "Mama, why are these stones different?" He was right. The foundation stones were clearly much older than the wooden structure above, covered in strange carved symbols that reminded Itzel of the illustrations in medieval manuscripts she'd studied in college. "I don't know, sweetheart," she joined him. "This cabin might be built on something much older." As night fell and they huddled around the small fire, Itzel opened her backpack and took inventory of their supplies. A few jars of baby food, some crackers, 2 bottles of water, a box of diapers. It wouldn't last long. Tomorrow she would need to find the nearest town and figure out their next steps. "We're going to be okay," she told Timothy. "This is just temporary. I promise." "I know, Mama," he said. "Dad always said you were the strongest person he ever met." Tears pricked at Itzel's eyes. Garrett had been her rock, her partner in everything. His death had left a hole in her heart that nothing could fill. She kissed Timothy's forehead and moved to check on Iris. That's when she noticed something peculiar. The floorboards in the center of the room didn't quite match the others. They were newer, as if they were replaced to cover something beneath. In the flickering firelight, the difference was subtle but unmistakable. A strange sound echoed from below their feet, not settling wood, but something like distant footsteps on stone. Timothy sat up in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide. "What was that, Mama?" "I don't know," she whispered, "but we're going to find out." The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the broken windows and illuminating the cabin's dusty interior. Itzel had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about the strange sounds and the mismatched floorboards. Timothy, with the resilience of childhood, had eventually drifted off, but Itzel had remained awake, listening intently. The sounds had not returned. Driven by curiosity and desperate hope that there might be something of value to sell, Itzel searched the shed after breakfast and found a rusty crowbar among the abandoned tools. With Timothy holding Iris on the porch, safely away from potential debris, she returned to the mismatched floorboards. "Stand back, sweetheart," she warned, wedging the crowbar between two boards. "This might splinter." The wood groaned in protest as she applied pressure, then gave way with a sudden crack. Itzel stumbled backward, regained her balance, and peered into the gap she'd created. Instead of dirt or a root cellar, there was only darkness below, and what appeared to be a stone step. "Timothy, bring me the flashlight from my backpack," she called. With the child-sized flashlight in hand, Itzel pried up more boards, revealing what was unmistakably a stone staircase descending into darkness. The steps were cut from solid rock and disappeared into the earth beneath the cabin. "What is it, Mama?" Timothy asked. "I'm not sure," Itzel replied, "but I think someone built this cabin over something much older." She debated what to do. The responsible choice would be to secure the opening and head into town for supplies. But the mystery beneath her feet pulled at her, and practical concerns, like what to do with Iris, momentarily faded. "Can we go down there?" Timothy's voice quivered. Itzel made a quick decision. She fashioned a secure sling for Iris from her jacket, binding the baby tightly to her chest. "Stay right behind me," she instructed Timothy, handing him the flashlight. "If I tell you to go back up, you do it immediately. Understand?" Timothy nodded solemnly, clutching the flashlight with white-knuckled determination. The stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, dipping slightly in the middle where countless feet had trod. Itzel counted 17 steps before they reached the bottom, emerging into a vaulted stone chamber carved from living rock. The air was surprisingly fresh, suggesting some form of ventilation system. Timothy shone the flashlight around, revealing walls lined with faded tapestries bearing a coat of arms, a black raven clutching a golden crown. The emblem was repeated in stone carvings and on a shield mounted above what appeared to be an ancient wooden door, now sealed by collapsed stonework. "Ravens," Timothy whispered. "Like Ravenscroft Castle?" "Maybe," Itzel murmured. In the center of the chamber sat an ornate chest of dark wood bound with tarnished silver. Unlike everything else in the room, it appeared to have been placed there relatively recently, perhaps within the last century. It wasn't covered in the thick layer of dust that blanketed the rest of the chamber. "Should we open it?" Timothy asked, directing the flashlight beam at the chest. Itzel approached cautiously, half expecting it to be locked, but the lid lifted easily on well-oiled hinges. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had preserved them perfectly, they found a stack of documents that made Itzel's breath catch in her throat. The top document was a royal patent written on vellum, bearing a seal that even Itzel, with her limited knowledge of British history, recognized as dating back hundreds of years. Beneath it were property deeds, maps, and genealogical charts, all preserved with obvious care. "What is it, Mama?" Timothy asked. Itzel's hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the documents one by one, laying them on the stone floor. What she found stunned her into silence. royal patents and land grants dating to 1398, bearing the seal of King Richard II, property deeds for Ravenscroft Castle and 14,000 surrounding acres. A complete family genealogy tracing the Blackthorn line back to Crusader Knights. A survey map showing underground passages connecting the Cardandad cabin site to the castle, and at the bottom of the chest, a modern envelope addressed simply, "To my beloved Itzel." She recognized Garrett's handwriting immediately, and tears sprang to her eyes. With shaking fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My darling Itzel," it began in Garrett's familiar script. "If you're reading this, they've given you what they think is worthless. The truth is beneath your feet. Our children's legacy awaits across the valley. My brothers and sister know nothing of our true heritage. My grandfather kept it from them, fearing their greed. Now it falls to you to reclaim what rightfully belongs to our children. Trust no one from my family. The proof you need is all here. All my love, forever, Garrett." Itzel pressed the letter to her heart, a sob escaping her lips. Even from beyond the grave, Garrett was protecting them. But what did it all mean? She looked again at the documents spread before her, their implications slowly dawning. "Timothy," she whispered, "I think your father was trying to tell us something very important about that castle." The following morning, Itzel awoke with renewed purpose. She'd spent half the night studying the documents by firelight, her mind reeling with their implications. If what she'd discovered was true, and the evidence seemed undeniable, then the Blackthorns' cruel joke had backfired spectacularly. After a breakfast of crackers and the last of their bottled water, Itzel packed the most critical documents into her backpack, secured Iris in her makeshift sling, and set out with Timothy across the valley toward Ravenscroft Castle. The ancient property maps showed a direct path that wound through the woods, cutting the journey to just under 2 miles. "Are we really going to the castle, Mama?" Timothy asked. The adventure had lifted his spirits considerably. "We are," Itzel confirmed. The path emerged from the woods onto a well-maintained road. What Itzel discovered took her breath away. Ravenscroft Castle wasn't abandoned as Marcus had claimed. It was beautifully maintained, with manicured gardens and a steady stream of visitors lining up at the entrance. Tour buses were parked in a modern lot, and signs directed visitors to a gift shop and cafe. "Is it open to people?" Timothy asked. "It seems that way," Itzel murmured, approaching the main entrance where a ticket booth had been set up against the ancient stone walls. At the entrance, a brass plaque caught her attention. It read, "Ravenscroft Castle, managed by Ashworth Heritage Management. Private ownership disputed since 1943. Daily tours available." Itzel stared at the words, "ownership disputed." It aligned perfectly with what she'd discovered in the documents. A legal battle had erupted during World War II when the last known heir had died without children. According to the genealogy charts, Garrett's grandfather had been the rightful heir but had never pressed his claim, choosing instead to start a new life in America. A woman in her 50s approached, clipboard in hand, looking curiously at Itzel and the children. She wore a tailored blazer with a name badge that identified her as Dr. Helena Ashworth. "Can I help you?" she asked. "If you're here for the tour, tickets are available at the booth." "Actually," Itzel began hesitantly, "I'm here about the ownership situation mentioned on your plaque. That's a complicated legal matter handled by our solicitors in London." "If you're a journalist—" "I'm not," Itzel interrupted. "My name is Itzel Blackthorn. My late husband was Garrett Blackthorn, and I believe he, or rather, our children, may be the rightful heirs to Ravenscroft." "Blackthorn, you say? That name is certainly relevant to the castle's history. But we've had many claimants over the years." "I have documents," Itzel said. When Dr. Ashworth saw the ancient royal charter and property deeds, her professional composure cracked. She nearly dropped her clipboard, quickly motioning for them to follow her away from the public area. "Dear God," she whispered once they were inside her private office, examining the documents with a jeweler's loupe she'd pulled from her desk drawer. These are genuine. The wax seal, the parchment aging, the ink composition, all consistent with late 14th century documentation. She looked up at Itzel with new respect. "Do you realize what this means?" "I'm beginning to," Itzel replied, "but I'd appreciate your expertise." Dr. Ashworth set down the loop and leaned back in her chair. "This castle has been generating millions in revenue for decades, and legally, it all belongs to your children. The Ashworth Heritage Trust has been managing the property since the ownership dispute began, holding the profits in escrow until the true heir could be determined." Over the next hour, Dr. Ashworth gave them a private tour of the castle, revealing the full scope of what Itzel had inherited. The medieval structure was far more than just a historic building. It was a thriving enterprise. The 12th century Norman kept housed priceless medieval artifacts, attracting scholars from around the world. Tudor galleries displayed original portraits worth millions individually. Victorian staterooms were rented for weddings at €50 per event. The gift shop and restaurant generated £300 annually, while film production companies paid £100 or more to use the castle as a location for period dramas. Current annual net profit is approximately £4.2 million, Dr. Ashworth explained as they stood on the battlements overlooking the vast estate. That's about $5.2 million in American currency, all held in trust, accumulating interest, waiting for the rightful owner to claim it. Itzel gripped the stone parapet to steady herself. The amount was staggering. Just yesterday, she'd been counting pennies for bread. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Ashworth continued, her voice lowered. "The trust has been fighting off aggressive acquisition attempts for years. A company called Blackthorn Global Investments has been particularly persistent." "Blackthorn Global? That's my brother-in-law Roderick's company." "Indeed," Dr. Ashworth noted. "He's offered to buy the property outright several times, claiming family connection but never providing documentation like yours. The trust always refused, stating that the property wasn't for sale until ownership was legally established. He knew," she whispered. "Roderick knew about the castle's connection to our family. That's why he gave me the cabin. He thought the documents were lost or destroyed." "If these papers check out," Dr. Ashworth said, gesturing to Itzel's backpack, "and I believe they will, your children stand to inherit not just this castle, but one of the largest private fortunes in English heritage properties." Timothy, who had been unusually quiet during the tour, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Does this mean we're not poor anymore, Mama?" Before Itzel could answer, her phone chimed with an incoming message, the first since they'd arrived in England, and she'd turned on international roaming. It was a text from an unknown number. "Saw you at the castle. Big mistake. Some things should stay buried. We'll be taking the children for their own safety." Itzel's blood ran cold as she showed the message to Dr. Ashworth, whose face paled. "I think," the heritage director said, "we should call my solicitor immediately, and perhaps the police as well." Word spread through the heritage management community like wildfire. By evening, local news vans had gathered at the castle gates, and by the following morning, the story had reached international outlets. "American Widow Discovers Castle Fortune," read one headline. "From Dollar Cabin to 100 Million Castle," proclaimed another. Dr. Ashworth had insisted that Itzel and the children stay in the castle's dark, private apartments, usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "It's safer here," she'd explained. Itzel was grateful for the protection, especially after the threatening text message. The police had taken it seriously, documenting the threat and increasing patrols around the castle grounds. On the third day, exactly as Dr. Ashworth had predicted, the Blackthorn family descended on the valley like locusts. Roderick arrived in a helicopter that landed on the castle's ancient jousting field, the downdraft threatening the carefully tended rose bushes. Cordelia and Marcus followed in a convoy of black SUVs, accompanied by a team of expensively dressed lawyers clutching leather briefcases. From the safety of Dr. Ashworth's office, Itzel watched through the window as they approached the main entrance, no longer laughing as they had been at the cabin. "Shall I meet with them?" Dr. Ashworth asked. "No," Itzel said. "Let them talk to your legal team. I don't trust myself not to say something I'll regret." Dr. Ashworth nodded. "Wise decision. The solicitors will record everything." Later that afternoon, security footage showed Roderick in the castle's conference room, his face flushed with anger as he pounded the antique table. "This is obviously a hoax," he declared to the assembled lawyers and castle administrators. "Those documents are forgeries. My family has been researching our genealogy for years. There's no castle in our lineage." One of the Ashworth Trust lawyers, a silver-haired woman with penetrating eyes, slid a folder across the table. "These are the preliminary authentication reports from 3 independent experts. The documents are genuine, dating exactly to the periods they claim to represent. Furthermore, we've located corroborating evidence in the county archives." Marcus, always the quietest of the siblings, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he suggested to Roderick, who silenced him with a glare. Cordelia, ever the family diplomat, adopted a different strategy. When the legal confrontation yielded no results, she approached the castle staff, putting on her most sympathetic voice for anyone who would listen. "We're very concerned about Itzel's mental state," she told a groundskeeper who had no idea who she was. "Grief can make people believe impossible things. We only want to help our dear sister-in-law get the professional help she needs." Her words reached Itzel through the castle staff, who had already formed a protective circle around the new lady of the castle and her children. Timothy had become something of a mascot to the tour guides, who delighted in teaching him about his ancestors depicted in the portrait gallery. But the Blackthorns weren't finished. That evening, Itzel received a call from the family's attorney in America. "Mrs. Blackthorn, I'm required to inform you that my clients have filed for emergency custody of Timothy and Iris, claiming you are suffering from delusions and putting the children at risk by dragging them to England on a wild goose chase." Itzel nearly dropped the Essel phone. "They're doing what?" "The filing claims you're mentally unstable, living in a dilapidated cabin with no running water and refusing professional help. They're requesting temporary custody until a full psychological evaluation can be performed." The legal battle had begun in earnest, with millions at stake and the Blackthorns willing to use even her children as pawns. Dr. Ashworth found Itzel sitting on the floor of the luxurious guest apartment, tears streaming down her face as Timothy tried to comfort her. "It's going to be all right, Mama," he kept saying. Dr. Ashworth knelt beside them. "Your son is wiser than most adults I know," she said. "And he's right. The Blackthorns are terrified because they've just realized they gave away a fortune through their own cruelty." She helped Itzel to her feet, "But we're not going to let them win. I've called Professor Edmund Whitmore. He's Britain's leading expert on historical genealogy and DNA analysis. If anyone can provide definitive proof of your children's claim, it's him." "But the custody filing," Itzel began, her voice breaking, "is baseless and won't stand up to scrutiny," Dr. Ashworth assured her, "especially once the world sees where you're actually living." She gestured around the opulent apartment. "But we need to move quickly. The Blackthorns have money and influence, and they're not afraid to use it." "What do we need to do?" Itzel asked. "We're going to need DNA samples," Dr. Ashworth explained, "from your children and, if possible, from the Blackthorn siblings as well. Professor Whitmore will compare them with samples from the castle's family crypt." "The crypt?" Timothy's eyes widened. "There are dead people here?" "Many generations of your ancestors," Dr. Ashworth confirmed with a gentle smile. "And they're going to help us prove that you belong here." As they formulated their plan, the Blackthorn siblings gathered in the luxury hotel they'd commandeered in the nearby village. Roderick paced the room, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. "This can't be happening," he fumed. "That gold-digging nobody can't possibly steal what should be ours." "Perhaps we should consider a settlement," Cordelia suggested. "If the documents are authentic, they can't be," Roderick exploded. "And even if they are, who's to say Garrett's brats are the rightful heirs? For all we know, she cheated on him. We should demand paternity tests." Marcus, staring out the window at the castle silhouetted against the evening sky, spoke without turning around. "What if we've been wrong all along? What if grandfather knew about the castle and deliberately kept it from us?" Roderick's glass shattered against the wall near Marcus's head. "Don't you dare suggest that. We're the true Blackthorns. That woman and her children are nothing." As Marcus dabbed whiskey from his sleeve, a hotel porter knocked on the door, delivering an envelope bearing the Ashworth Heritage Trust seal. Inside was a formal invitation. "The board of the Ashworth Heritage Trust requests the pleasure of your company at Ravenscroft Castle tomorrow at 10 a.m. for a genealogical presentation by offers Professor Edmund Whitmore regarding the definitive determination of Ravenscroft's rightful heirs." Cordelia scanned the invitation, then looked up at her brothers with trepidation. "It sounds like they've found something conclusive. Or they're bluffing," Roderick countered. "Get me our PR team. We're going to need to control this narrative before it gets out of hand." Professor Edmund Whitmore arrived at Ravenscroft Castle at dawn, a compact man with wild white hair and the energetic demeanor of someone half his 70 years. He carried specialized equipment in aluminum cases and was accompanied by 2 graduate students who treated him with reverent deference. "Dr. Ashworth, wonderful to see you again," he called out. "And this must be Mrs. Blackthorn and the young heirs." He beamed at Itzel and the children. "Remarkable story. Simply remarkable. Can't wait to get to the bottom of it." Itzel found his enthusiasm oddly comforting after days of tension. "Thank you for coming, Professor. I understand you're the best in your field." "Oh, the very best," he agreed. "Now, I've reviewed the documents you sent over, and they're extraordinary. The genealogical charts are particularly detailed, quite unusual for the period, but documents can be forged, even expertly. DNA, however, never lies." Over the next few hours, Professor Whitmore and his team set up a mobile laboratory in one of the castle's modernized chambers. They took cheek swab samples from Timothy and Iris, carefully cataloging them in sterile containers. "Now, for the ancestral samples," the professor announced, leading them down a spiral staircase to the castle crypt. Timothy clung to Itzel's hand as they entered the cool, dimly lit chamber beneath the castle's chapel. Stone sarcophagi lined the walls, each bearing the Ravenscroft crest, the raven with the crown, and inscriptions dating back centuries. "We won't need to disturb any remains," Professor Whitmore assured them, approaching a sealed glass case containing artifacts. During restoration work in the 1980s, hair and bone samples were preserved from several key members of the lineage, including the 12th Earl of Ravenscroft, who died in 1897. According to your genealogy charts, he would be your children's direct ancestor. While the professor worked, Dr. Ashworth gave Itzel a quiet update. "The Blackthorns have confirmed they'll attend the presentation. They've brought their own expert, a genealogist from Columbia University, but I'm not concerned. Edmund's reputation is unassailable." At precisely 10 a.m., the Blackthorn siblings arrived, accompanied by their legal team and a stern-looking woman introduced as Dr. Elaine Harper, their genealogical expert. Roderick refused to look directly at Itzel, while Cordelia made a show of asking about the children's welfare with honeyed insincerity. Marcus alone seemed genuinely uncomfortable, offering Itzel a small nod that might almost have been apologetic. Professor Whitmore commanded the room the moment he began speaking, his academic authority silencing even Roderick's attempts at interruption. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a genealogical mystery spanning 6 centuries," he began. "The Ravenscroft lineage, later known as Blackthorn, after a royal decree in 1583 permitted the name change, has been meticulously documented through these records." He walked them through the family tree, pointing out key marriages and births that connected the modern Blackthorns to the medieval earls. Dr. Harper attempted to raise objections about the document's authenticity, but Whitmore overwhelmed her with technical details about parchment aging and ink composition that she was clearly unprepared to counter. "But documents, no matter how convincing, are not our only evidence," Professor Whitmore continued. Through DNA analysis comparing samples from the castle's family crypt with Itzel's children, we have proven beyond any scientific doubt that Timothy and Iris Blackthorne are direct descendants of the original castle owners. He projected a DNA comparison chart that even the lay people in the room could understand, the matching segments highlighted in green. The probability of this match occurring by chance is less than 1 in 500 million, he declared. Young Timothy and baby Iris are, without question, the blood descendants of the Ravenscroft Earls. Roderick leapt to his feet. This proves nothing. Of course they're descendants. We all are. The question is who has the primary claim. Professor Whitmore smiled patiently. I was coming to that, Mr. Blackthorne. You see, the DNA analysis revealed something else quite fascinating. He clicked to the next slide. When we compared your DNA profile, obtained from the water glass you used during yesterday's meeting, with the ancestral samples, we found something unexpected. The new chart showed far fewer green segments in Roderick's column. You, Mr. Blackthorne, along with your sister and brother, are indeed related to the Ravenscroft line, but not through the direct male lineage as young Timothy Island. Your connection comes through a female relative who married into the family in 1897. In genealogical terms, you are descendants of a cadet branch, a secondary line with no direct claim to the titles or entailed properties. The great hall fell silent as the implications sank in. Then Dr. Ashworth delivered the final blow. Moreover, our archivists have made an extraordinary discovery in the castle records. The cabin where you housed Itzel and her children is actually the original gatehouse of Ravenscroft Castle, built in 1402 as the first defensive position of the estate. The underground chamber Itzel discovered was a secret vault designed to protect the family documents during times of war. She turned to Itzel. When you were mockingly given the deed to that worthless property for $1, you were actually given the key to unlocking the entire estate's ownership. More shocking discoveries emerged as Professor Whitmore continued his time. Presentation. The castle archives, now fully open to investigation, revealed treasures beyond imagining. Hidden chambers within the castle walls containing medieval gold and jewels worth £2 million. Original manuscripts, including illuminated Bibles valued at £800, 0 each wine cellars, with bottles dating to the 1600s, worth £30, 0 per bottle. An art collection hidden during World War II, including 2 lost Van Dyck paintings believed destroyed in the Blitz. The total value of these previously undocumented assets, Dr. Ashworth concluded, exceeds £40 million, but the most damning evidence against the Blackthorne siblings came from their own genealogy research. Professor Whitmore had obtained access to their private family records through a court order, discovering that they had known all along about their secondary status in the family line. This document, he said, holding up a paper bearing Roderick's signature, is a research commission from 2015 in which you specifically asked historians to find a way to circumvent the primary heir problem in the Blackthorne line. You knew you were from an illegitimate branch with no legal claim to inheritance. Marcus stood suddenly. I've heard enough, he said. Roderick, Cordelia, he's right. Grandfather explained this to me years ago. We are descended from the housekeeper's daughter who married a distant cousin. We have Blackthorne blood, but we're not in the direct line. That's why Grandfather was so insistent that Garrett marry someone from the right bloodline. He was trying to strengthen the primary claim for future generations. Roderick's face contorted with fury. You knew? All this time? I thought you knew too, Marcus replied. Why else would you have been so desperate to get control of the castle? Why else would you have tried to keep Itzel away? Roderick lunged across the table at his brother, but security personnel intervened before he could reach him. As they restrained Roderick, a small black notebook fell from his inner pocket, landing open on the table. Dr. Ashworth picked it up, her eyes widening as she scanned the pages. This is a record of property transactions, she said. Properties belonging to elderly Blackthorne relatives, all transferred to Blackthorne Global Investments. She looked up at Roderick, who had stopped struggling against the security guards. Did these relatives know they were signing over their assets to your company? The silence that followed was answer enough. I believe, Dr. Ashworth said, we should adjourn this meeting and contact the proper authorities. It appears we may be looking at evidence of fraud, in addition to the threatened custody action against Mrs. Blackthorne. As the Blackthorne siblings were escorted from the Great Hall, Roderick and Cordelia fuming, Marcus with his head bowed. Timothy tugged at Itzel's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, "does this mean the castle really belongs to us now?" Itzel knelt to look her son in the eyes, aware that their lives had changed irrevocably in the span of a single morning. "It seems that way, sweetheart, but more importantly, we've discovered the truth about your father's family, the real truth." Professor Whitmore packed away his equipment, beaming with satisfaction. "Genealogy is never just about the past, Mrs. Blackthorne," he observed. "It's about understanding who we are in the present. Your children are the true heirs of Ravenscroft, not just by blood, but by character. Your late husband would be proud." As Itzel stood in the great hall of what was now confirmed to be her children's ancestral home, she felt Garrett's presence more strongly than she had since his death. The question now was what she would do with this unexpected kingdom that had fallen into her lap, and how to protect her children from those who would still try to take it away. As the court case unfolded over the following weeks, Itzel found herself at the center of a storm that extended far beyond the ownership of Ravenscroft Castle. What had begun as a simple inheritance dispute had mushroomed into an international investigation spanning 2 continents. Itzel's lawyer, Meredith Chambers, a formidable litigator provided by the Ashworth Trust, had subpoenaed the Blackthorne siblings' financial records as part of their defense against the custody claim. What she uncovered was devastating. The Blackthorne siblings have been systematically defrauding elderly relatives for years, Meredith explained during a private meeting in the castle's library. They used forged documents to claim inheritances that weren't rightfully theirs. Dr. Ashworth, who had become Itzel's closest ally, shook her head in disgust. "How many victims are we talking about?" "At least 7 that we can document," Meredith replied. "All elderly Blackthorne relatives, most suffering from dementia or other cognitive impairments. The siblings would visit, present documents that appeared to be investment opportunities, and walk away with property deeds, stock certificates, and other assets. They targeted their own family," she whispered. "Their own blood. That's what makes it so insidious," Meredith agreed. "The victims trusted them implicitly because of the family connection. I've forwarded all of this to the FBI. They've opened an investigation. Within days, the FBI's white-collar crime division had dispatched agents to interview the Blackthorne siblings, who had retreated to their hotel in the village. Bank records obtained through federal warrants showed they'd stolen over $3.2 million from family trusts and elderly relatives across 3 states. The investigation quickly spiraled, with financial crimes investigators from both American and British authorities collaborating across borders. The Blackthorns' assets were frozen, and their passports confiscated to prevent flight risk. Meanwhile, the custody case against Itzel collapsed as spectacularly as it had been filed. Judge Eleanor Hargrove of the Family Division of the High Court took one look at the evidence and dismissed the case with prejudice, adding a stern rebuke to the Blackthorns for attempting to weaponize the family court system for financial gain. "These children are clearly well cared for and deeply loved," the judge noted. "The custody petition appears to be nothing more than a shameful attempt to gain control of their inheritance. This court will not be party to such manipulation." With the custody threat neutralized, Itzel could focus on securing her children's legacy. The Ashworth Trust formally recognized Timothy and Iris as the rightful heirs to Ravenscroft, transferring control of the estate and its considerable trust fund to Itzel as their guardian. The criminal case against the Blackthorne siblings moved swiftly. Prosecutors in both countries coordinated charges, focusing on the most egregious examples of fraud. The evidence was overwhelming: forged signatures, manipulated bank transfers, and testimonies from caregivers who had witnessed the siblings' visits to vulnerable relatives. In a dramatic courtroom moment that made international Headlines: Roderick broke down under cross-examination, trying desperately to negotiate immunity by implicating his siblings. "We thought we were the real heirs," he shouted. "We deserved that money more than some stranger Garrett dragged home." Cordelia maintained her innocence until presented with her own signature on forged documents. She actually fainted when the judge announced criminal charges, collapsing in the witness box and requiring medical attention before proceedings could continue. Marcus, surprisingly, offered a full confession and expressed genuine remorse. "I was weak," he admitted to the court. "I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I never had the courage to stand against my brother and sister. I've lived my entire life in Roderick's shadow, afraid to challenge him." His contrition earned him a reduced sentence, 5 years compared to Roderick's 15 and Cordelia's 8, but still, the Blackthorn siblings were headed to prison, their reputations and freedom forfeit to their own greed. Throughout the proceedings, Itzel maintained her dignity, refusing to gloat or seek revenge. When reporters asked for her reaction to the sentences, she simply said, "Justice has been served. Now my children and I can focus on honoring the legacy that's been entrusted to us." That legacy was proving to be even more substantial than initially believed, as the castle's archives were properly catalogued for the first time in decades. New treasures emerged. A collection of Anglo-Saxon jewelry buried in the castle walls during a 16th century siege. A previously unknown Shakespeare First Folio found in the library. Correspondence between the 7th Earl of Ravenscroft and Queen Elizabeth I that shed new light on political intrigues of the Tudor era. Academics and museum curators from around the world began requesting access to the collections, bringing renewed prestige to Ravenscroft Castle. Tourism increased by 300% as the dramatic story of the American nurse who inherited a castle spread through international media. Through it all, Itzel remained focused on creating a stable home for her children. She enrolled Timothy in the local village school, where he quickly became a favorite among both teachers and students. Baby Iris thrived as well, taking her first steps in the castle's rose garden under the watchful eyes of staff who had rapidly become like extended family. Dr. Ashworth, in particular, had assumed a grandmother-like role, doting on both children and offering Itzel guidance on navigating her new position. "You're doing remarkably well," she told Itzel one evening, as they sat in the private family drawing room. Many people would be overwhelmed by such a sudden change in circumstances. Itzel smiled. "I've spent my life adapting to circumstances beyond my control," she said. "The foster system teaches you resilience, if nothing else. The difference now is that I can finally provide real stability for my children." But stability didn't mean the challenges were over. As the criminal cases against the Blackthorns approached their conclusion, disturbing reports reached Itzel through Meredith. Former associates of Roderick had been seen in the village, asking questions about castle security. An unknown car had been spotted parked along the perimeter of the estate for hours at a time. "It could be nothing," Meredith cautioned. "Just tabloid journalists hoping for photographs. But I've arranged for additional security as a precaution." That night, as Itzel tucked Timothy into bed in his tower room, now decorated with space posters and model airplanes to make it feel more like a little boy's room than a medieval chamber, he asked the question that had been on his mind for days. "Mama, are the bad people going to try to take our castle away?" Itzel sat on the edge of his bed, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "No, sweetheart. The castle belongs to you and Iris now, legally and forever. No one can take it away. But Uncle Roderick is really mad at us," Timothy persisted. "Your Uncle Roderick made bad choices, and now he has to face the consequences. That makes him angry, yes. But he can't hurt us. We have good people protecting us. Dad would be happy we found our castle, wouldn't he?" "Yes," Itzel whispered. "Your dad made sure we would find it. He left us clues because he knew how smart and brave you are." As she left Timothy's room, Itzel paused in the stone corridor, placing her hand against the cool wall of the castle that had become their sanctuary. After a lifetime of uncertainty and loss, she had finally found a place where she and her children truly belonged. The morning dawned misty and ethereal, with Ravenscroft Castle rising like an island from a sea of fog. Itzel stood at the window of the master chamber, watching as security personnel conducted their morning patrol along the castle walls. The increased protection measures were both reassuring and troubling, necessary, but a constant reminder of potential threats. A soft knock at her door broke her reverie. Dr. Ashworth entered, carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that combined excitement with concern. "I've been researching something that's been bothering me," she said. "The cabin, or gatehouse, rather. Why would Garrett's grandfather have purchased it separately from the castle, and why keep the family documents there instead of in the castle archives?" Itzel gestured for her to sit. "I've wondered that myself. It seems an odd place to hide such important papers." "Exactly." Dr. Ashworth spread photographs across the table, aerial views of the estate from different periods. "Look at these. In 1943, when the ownership dispute began, the gatehouse was still clearly part of the castle grounds. But by 1950, a new property line had been drawn, separating it from the main estate." She pointed to a document, a deed transfer. "This shows that Thomas Blackthorne, Garrett's grandfather, purchased just the gatehouse property in 1951, shortly after moving to America. He paid a nominal sum to the trust that was managing the disputed estate. But why?" Itzel asked. "Why not try to claim the entire castle if he had the documentation to prove ownership?" "I believe he was playing the long game," Dr. Ashworth explained. "Europe was still recovering from World War II. The legal battle would have been expensive and protracted, with no guarantee of success. By purchasing just the gatehouse, which everyone else considered worthless, he secured the documentary evidence for future generations while avoiding a direct confrontation. So he hid the documents beneath the floorboards and waited," Itzel murmured. "But why didn't he tell his family? Why didn't Garrett know until—" She trailed off, a new thought forming. "Until when?" Dr. Ashworth prompted. "Until shortly before he died," Itzel said. "Garrett made a trip to visit his grandfather's sister, his great-aunt Eleanor, about 3 months before his accident. He came back different somehow, more serious. He started researching family history, spending hours on genealogy websites. Eleanor Blackthorne is still alive. She's 94 and lives in a retirement community in Virginia. I found her while tracing the family connections. You think she told Garrett about the castle? About the documents in the gatehouse? It would explain the timing," Dr. Ashworth confirmed. "And there's something else. According to the visitor logs at her retirement community, Roderick visited Eleanor 2 weeks after Garrett did, and 2 more times before Garrett's death. You think Garrett's death wasn't an accident? I think we need to speak with Eleanor Blackthorne, and we need to be very careful about who knows we're doing it." Within hours, a plan had crystallized. Dr. Ashworth would fly to Virginia to interview Eleanor personally, under the guise of collecting oral histories for the castle archives. Itzel would remain at Ravenscroft with the children, maintaining normal routines to avoid arousing suspicion. Meredith Chambers, who had joined their inner circle of trust, arranged for additional security measures, subtle ones that wouldn't be easily detected. Castle staff were vetted more thoroughly, visitor logs scrutinized, and Timothy's school was briefed on enhanced pickup procedures. "We're probably being overly cautious," Meredith acknowledged. "But with the sentencing hearing approaching, tensions are high. We can't be too careful." The next 5 days passed with excruciating slowness. Itzel maintained a calm exterior for Timothy's benefit, but internally she was a bundle of nerves. Each night, she checked and rechecked the locks on the children's rooms, grateful for the castle's thick walls and limited access points. On the evening of the 5th day, Dr. Ashworth returned, looking exhausted but triumphant. She met Itzel in the secure conference room they'd established in the castle's former war room, deep within the Norman keep. "Eleanor Blackthorne is a remarkable woman," she began, sharp as a tack at 94, and not at all intimidated by Roderick or his threats. She confirmed our suspicions, and then some. Dr. Ashworth played a recording of the interview, Eleanor's voice was thin but clear, her Virginia accent still strong despite decades of upper-class elocution lessons. Of course, I told Garrett about his inheritance. It was his birthright. Thomas, my brother, made me promise to tell only the direct heir, and only when the time was right. When Garrett visited me last year and told me about his children, I knew it was time. The direct line would continue. Dr. Ashworth fast-forwarded through some general conversation to another key section. Roderick was furious when he found out I'd spoken to Garrett, demanded to know what I'd told him. When I wouldn't say, he threatened to have me declared incompetent and put in a home. Said he'd take control of my affairs for my own good. But I've outlasted smarter men than my grandnephew. I told him nothing. There were more details about the history of the gatehouse, how Thomas had discovered the hidden chamber during a childhood visit to England, how he had meticulously preserved the documents even as he built a new life in America. He always meant to reclaim the castle, Eleanor explained, but the war came and then business troubles. He died believing he'd failed, but he made me promise to watch over the direct line. When Garrett married that lovely nurse, I was so pleased. She has the strength the Blackthorns have always needed. Did she say anything about Garrett's death? Itzel asked. Dr. Ashworth nodded. She doesn't believe it was an accident. Garrett called her the night before, excited about something he'd discovered in the family research. He told her he was going to confront Roderick the next day. That was the last time she heard from him. The brakes on his car failed, Itzel said. The police said it was mechanical failure, wear and tear, but Garrett was meticulous about maintenance. He never missed a service appointment. Eleanor thinks Roderick found out about the gatehouse but not the exact location of the documents. That's why he gave it to you. He hoped you'd sell it quickly out of desperation, and he could buy it back through a shell company. But I didn't sell, Itzel murmured. I stayed and found exactly what he'd been searching for. Dr. Ashworth reached across the table and squeezed Itzel's hand. Eleanor recorded a formal statement for the authorities. She's also amended her will to leave everything to your children, with you as trustee. She's quite wealthy in her own right. Her late husband founded a pharmaceutical company. What do we do with this information? She asked finally. Meredith has already forwarded the recording to the FBI agents handling the fraud case. They'll investigate the accident as a potential homicide, but it may be difficult to prove after all this time. And in the meantime, we continue strengthening your position. The sentencing hearing is in 3 days. Once the Blackthorns are formally imprisoned, many of their resources will be cut off. But we need to be vigilant about associates who might act on their behalf. That vigilance paid off the very next day, when security intercepted a castle groundskeeper attempting to access the family quarters with an unauthorized keycard. Under questioning, he admitted that a man matching the description of Roderick's former head of security had offered him £50 to place listening devices in Itzel's rooms and gather information about her daily routines. The groundskeeper was arrested, and security protocols were immediately enhanced. Timothy's school temporarily suspended outdoor activities, keeping students inside the building. Itzel canceled her planned trip to London, where she had been scheduled to meet with heritage conservation experts. The circle is tightening, Meredith observed during an emergency security briefing. We need to assume they're getting desperate as the sentencing approaches. The plan they devised was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than hunker down defensively, they would set a trap, using the castle itself as both bait and weapon. The Ravenscroft estate had survived sieges, civil wars, and Nazi bombing raids. Its ancient stones had protected generations of occupants. Now it would protect its newest mistress and her children. Every possible entry point is now monitored, the head of security explained, showing Itzel the surveillance system. Motion sensors, pressure plates, infrared beams, no one can approach without our knowledge. And the tunnels? Itzel asked. Sealed with steel doors, alarmed and under video surveillance. The only access is through the control room, which requires biometric identification. The trap was baited with carefully leaked information about a newly discovered vault containing in Reblains in biolite. Additional documentation about the Blackthorn inheritance. The story, planted through castle staff known to gossip in the village pub, suggested that Itzel would be cataloging these documents on the night before the sentencing hearing. As darkness fell on that appointed evening, Itzel sat in the secure control room with Meredith and the security team, watching the monitors that showed every approach to the castle. Timothy and Iris had been secretly relocated to Eleanor Blackthorn's Virginia estate that morning, accompanied by Dr. Ashworth and a private security detail. Movement at the north perimeter, the security chief announced just after midnight. 3 individuals approaching through the woods. Itzel leaned forward, studying the thermal imaging that showed 3 figures moving with practiced stealth toward the castle. They avoided the main paths, keeping to the shadows of ancient oak trees that dotted the estate. "They're heading for the old priest's hole entrance," Meredith observed, "just as we anticipated. Hold positions," the security chief instructed his team through the radio. "Let them enter the containment zone." Itzel watched, heart pounding, as the intruders reached the castle wall and began working on the ancient door with modern tools. Within minutes, they had breached the outer defenses and entered the narrow passage that would lead them to the Great Hall. "They're in the containment corridor," the security officer confirmed. "On my mark, 3, 2, 1, execute." On every monitor, Itzel watched as hidden doors slammed shut, trapping the intruders in a stone corridor with no exit. Lights flooded the space, momentarily blinding the men, and security personnel in tactical gear swarmed in from concealed positions. The operation was over in seconds. The intruders, Roderick's former security chief and 2 hired men with military backgrounds, were disarmed and restrained without a shot being fired. "We got them," Meredith said, "and the police have already arrested Roderick's attorney, who was waiting in a car half a mile away. His phone contains text messages explicitly ordering the men to eliminate the problem permanently." Itzel slumped in her chair, relief washing over her. "It's over then." "Yes," Meredith confirmed. "This is the evidence we needed. Attempted murder charges will be added to the fraud case. Roderick won't see freedom again for decades, if ever, and my children will be safe," Itzel whispered. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Malcolm Harrington prepared to deliver his verdict. The trial of the Blackthorn siblings had captivated the public imagination for weeks, with daily news coverage and courthouse crowds that required additional security. Today's sentencing hearing marked the culmination of a legal process that had exposed decades of fraud, manipulation, and ultimately, attempted murder. Itzel sat in the front row beside Meredith, her posture straight and her expression composed. Behind her, the gallery was packed with journalists, legal observers, and many of the Blackthorn's victims, elderly relatives who had finally seen justice for the assets stolen from them. At the defense table, the siblings presented a broken tableau. Roderick, once imperious and commanding, now sat hollow-eyed in his prison jumpsuit, the evidence of his murder plot having shattered any chance of leniency. Cordelia, her designer clothes exchanged for institutional garb, stared fixedly at her folded hands. Only Marcus showed any animation, occasionally turning to make eye contact with Itzel, his expression a complex mixture of remorse and resignation. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, silencing the last whispers in the courtroom. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered a case that combines such calculated greed with such callous disregard for family bonds," he began. "The evidence presented in this court has established beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendants engaged in a systematic conspiracy to defraud their own relatives, many of them elderly and vulnerable." He addressed each sibling individually, outlining their specific crimes and the evidence against them. When he came to the murder conspiracy, his tone grew even more severe. "Mr. Blackthorn, the evidence indicates that your brother's death was not the accident it appeared to be. While the reopened investigation continues, this court finds the evidence of your subsequent attempt to eliminate Mrs. Blackthorn and her children both credible and profoundly disturbing." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive, Roderick sentenced to 15 years for fraud, with additional charges pending for conspiracy to commit murder. Cordelia receiving 8 years for her role in the financial crimes, and Marcus, in recognition of his cooperation and apparent remorse, sentenced to 5 years with eligibility for parole after 3. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court orders full restitution to all victims, including the return of all misappropriated assets to their rightful owners. The defendant's personal assets are to be liquidated as necessary to satisfy these judgments. Outside the courthouse, under a bright spring sky, reporters clustered around Itzel and Meredith, shouting questions and thrusting microphones forward. Rather than avoid them, Itzel had decided to make a brief statement, hoping to put the public spectacle behind them once and for all. "Justice has been served today," she said, her voice clear. "Not just for my family, but for all those who were victimized by the Blackthorne siblings' greed. My late husband, Garrett, worked to uncover the truth before his death, and I believe he would be satisfied with this outcome." A reporter called out, "Will you be pressing for murder charges in your husband's death?" The investigation into Garrett's accident has been reopened based on new evidence. I trust the authorities to follow that evidence wherever it leads. My focus now is on my children and the responsibility we have to preserve Ravenscroft Castle for future generations. How does it feel to go from nearly homeless to owning a castle worth millions? The value of Ravenscroft isn't in its price tag, Itzel replied. Its true worth lies in its history, its cultural significance, and what it represents to the community that has maintained it for generations. My children and I are merely the current caretakers of a legacy that stretches back 6 centuries. Before more questions could be shouted, Meredith stepped forward. That's all for today. Mrs. Blackthorne will be focusing on her family and the Ravenscroft Heritage Foundation, which will be announced next week. Thank you. They made their way through the crowd to a waiting car, where Dr. Ashworth sat with Timothy. The boy had insisted on being present for the sentencing, feeling it was important to see this conclusion for himself. At 8 years old, he understood more than most children his age, having lived through extraordinary circumstances that had forced him to grapple with adult concepts of justice and betrayal. "Is it really over, Mama?" he asked. Itzel put her arm around him, drawing him close. "Yes, sweetheart. This part is over. Now we can focus on building our new life." Dr. Ashworth smiled from across the car. "And what a life it will be. The Heritage Board is thrilled with your plans for the castle." Those plans had evolved over weeks of careful consideration. Rather than treating the castle as a private residence isolated from the surrounding community, Itzel had decided to expand its role as both historical monument and living cultural center. The Great Hall would host educational programs for local schools. The extensive grounds would be opened for community events. And most significantly, a portion of the castle's tourism revenue would fund scholarships for children who had lost parents, a tribute to Garrett's memory. The court's ruling had been swift and decisive. Itzel and her children were the sole legal heirs to Ravenscroft Castle and all its holdings. The fraudulent siblings faced federal prison sentences and were ordered to pay $7 million in restitution to their victims that afternoon. Local news crews captured the moment Itzel walked up the castle's grand staircase with Timothy, officially taking possession through a ceremonial key presentation by the Ashworth Heritage Trust. Timothy, wide-eyed despite having lived in the castle for weeks during the legal proceedings, whispered a question that made the assembled dignitaries smile. "Mama, do we really live in a castle now?" "Yes," Itzel replied. "This is our home, and we're going to make it a home for many others too." In the following days, a stream of well-wishers arrived at Ravenscroft, local villagers bringing traditional welcome gifts, academics eager to access the archives, even distant Blackthorne relatives who had suffered at Roderick's hands and now sought to establish connections with the real family they'd never known existed. Among these visitors was a surprise. Marcus Blackthorne's wife and young daughters, aged 6 and 3. Catherine Blackthorne, a quiet woman who had always seemed overshadowed by her husband's domineering siblings, requested a private audience with Itzel. "I want to apologize," she said. "I suspected what Roderick and Cordelia were doing, but I was too afraid to speak up. Marcus tried to distance us from their schemes, but he was always the weakest of the three." Itzel studied the woman, seeing not an enemy, but another victim of the toxic dynamics that had ruled the Blackthorn family. "Your husband showed courage in the end," she said. "He told the truth when it mattered most. He told me to come to you, to show our daughters that the Blackthorn name doesn't have to mean greed and cruelty. He wants them to know they're cousins, to be part of something better than what he was part of." The request touched something in Itzel that she hadn't expected, a desire for her children to know their extended family, to have cousins and connections beyond the tragedy that had brought them to Ravenscroft. "Your daughters will always be welcome here," she said finally. "Timothy needs a family too. We all do." As Catherine left, promising to return with the girls for regular visits, Itzel felt a weight lifting. The cycle of division and resentment that had poisoned the Blackthorn family for generations was finally breaking. In its place, something new and healthier could grow. That evening, as she tucked Timothy into bed in his tower room, now thoroughly child-proofed despite its medieval architecture, he asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mama, are we rich now?" "We have more than we need," she said. "The castle generates income that will support us and help others too. But true wealth isn't about money, Timothy. It's about having a home, people who love you, and the opportunity to make a difference in the world. Dad would be happy about the scholarship, wouldn't he? Helping kids like me who don't have both parents?" "Very happy," Itzel agreed. As she closed his door, leaving it ajar the way he preferred, Itzel paused in the stone corridor, overwhelmed by how far they had come. From the brink of homelessness to the stewardship of a historic estate, from isolation to the center of a community, from victims to victors, the journey seemed almost as fantastical as the fairy tales she'd once read to Timothy. But unlike fairy tales, their story wouldn't end with happily ever after. There would be challenges ahead, responsibilities to navigate, a legacy to honor. The castle was not just a home, but a trust, one that would shape Timothy and Iris's lives in ways she was only beginning to understand. Yet, for the first time since Garrett's death, Itzel felt equal to whatever might come. The Blackthorn siblings had laughed when they gave her the cabin for $1, never imagining it would lead her to discover her children's birthright. Their mockery had become her strength, their cruelty transformed into her opportunity. 5 years passed with the swiftness that comes when life finds its proper rhythm. Ravenscroft Castle, once a symbol of ancient nobility, had transformed into something its medieval builders could never have imagined, a living legacy that balanced preservation with purpose, history with humanity. Timothy, now 13, had grown into a thoughtful young man who took genuine interest in his heritage. On weekends, he gave specialized castle tours for children, making history accessible through stories of knights, secret passages, and battles long past. And this is where they stored weapons during the Civil War, he explained to a group of wide-eyed schoolchildren, pointing to iron rings embedded in the wall of what was now the gift shop. Not the American Civil War, the English one, when Oliver Cromwell's men tried to take the castle. "My ancestors," he paused, still occasionally marveling at the concept, "supported the king, so they had to hide their best swords when Cromwell's soldiers came." Iris, at 5 years old, had no memory of the cabin or the struggle that had brought them to Ravenscroft. Born into near poverty but raised in privilege, she raced through halls where her ancestors had once ruled, treating ancient suits of armor like playground equipment, despite the tour guide's gentle reminders not to touch. "Careful, Miss Iris," called Albert, the head docent who had worked at the castle for 40 years. "Sorry, Mr. Albert," she called back, already dashing toward the next historical treasure that caught her eye. With her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit, Iris was the castle's living heartbeat, bringing childish laughter to rooms that had stood silent for centuries. Itzel had grown into her role as the steward of Ravenscroft with a grace that impressed even the most traditional members of British heritage circles. Under her guidance, the castle had maintained its historical integrity while evolving into a center for education and community. The cabin still sat across the valley, but now she'd restored it as a reminder of humble beginnings. Its roof had been replaced, windows repaired, and interior renovated to serve as a small museum telling the story of the castle's gatehouse and its pivotal role in preserving the Blackthorn legacy. Dr. Helena Ashworth, now in her 60s but still vibrant, had remained as the castle's heritage director and had become like family to the Blackthorns. She entered the solar, carrying a leather portfolio, her sensible shoes clicking on the stone floor. "The preparations for the Harvest Festival are complete," she announced. The annual Ravenscroft Harvest Festival had become a highlight of the local calendar, bringing together villagers, tourists, and heritage enthusiasts for a weekend of medieval-inspired celebrations. There would be archery competitions, traditional music, craft demonstrations, and a feast in the Great Hall that combined historical recipes with modern favorites. "Timothy is taking his role as host very seriously," Itzel replied. "He'll do splendidly," Helena assured her. "That boy was born for this. He has a natural understanding of the responsibility that comes with privilege." Itzel nodded, pride warming her heart. Despite the extraordinary circumstances of their lives, she had worked hard to keep her children grounded, to instill in them the values that had guided her own life: compassion, hard work, and gratitude. Timothy helped with castle maintenance during school holidays, learning practical skills alongside the staff. Iris, despite her young age, was already involved in sorting donations for the local food bank that operated from one of the castle's outbuildings. The contrast between their lives now and what might have been was never far from Itzel's mind. The Blackthorn siblings remained in prison, though Marcus had recently been granted parole for good behavior and had settled in a small town in the north, far from Ravenscroft and the painful memories it held. His ex-wife Catherine and their daughters were regular visitors to the castle, the girls now inseparable friends with Iris despite the age difference. Old Magnus Grimsby, the neighboring farmer who had once feared to acknowledge Itzel when the Blackthorn siblings were present, now served as the castle's head groundskeeper. "Your ladyship," he said, the title a playful formality they both enjoyed. "The day's mail has arrived. There's a letter for the young master that looks important, Cambridge University seal on it." Itzel accepted the envelope. Timothy, despite his youth, had been corresponding with several universities about their history programs, impressing academics with his detailed questions about medieval studies. "Thank you, Magnus," she said. "Will you join us for dinner this evening? Mrs. Potts is making her famous lamb stew, and you know how she feels when people miss her cooking." "Wouldn't dare disappoint Mrs. Potts," Magnus chuckled. As he returned to his duties, Itzel reflected on how thoroughly Ravenscroft had integrated with the surrounding community. The castle employed over 30 local residents full-time, from groundskeepers to tour guides to administrative staff. Its visitors brought vital revenue to village shops and restaurants. What had once been a symbol of aristocratic isolation had become an economic and cultural engine for the entire region. The final scene of their transformation played out that evening at the annual Ravenscroft Harvest Festival. Hundreds of locals and visitors gathered on castle grounds, enjoying entertainment that ranged from falconry demonstrations to traditional folk dancing. Food stalls offered everything from authentic medieval bread to modern British favorites, and children raced across the lawns, flying kites decorated with the Ravenscroft raven emblem. As Itzel addressed the crowd from the Great Hall steps, the camera crews from a documentary team filming a series on historic British estates captured the moment for posterity. Behind her stood Timothy and Iris, dressed in semi-formal attire that nodded to tradition while remaining appropriate for their ages. "Welcome to Ravenscroft," she began, her voice carrying across the attentive crowd. "5 years ago, when my children and I first arrived here, we were strangers to this land and its traditions. Today, thanks to your kindness and acceptance, we are proud to call this community our home." The crowd applauded warmly. Many remembered the dramatic story of how the American nurse and her children had discovered their inheritance and how the Blackthorn siblings' cruelty had backfired so spectacularly. Ravenscroft Castle has stood for over 800 years, Itzel continued. It has weathered wars, political upheavals, and changing times. It has been a fortress, a home, a museum, and now, we hope, a center for learning and community. My children and I are merely the current caretakers of this remarkable legacy, and we take that responsibility seriously. She gestured to Timothy, who stepped forward with newfound confidence. In the 5 years since they'd arrived at Ravenscroft, he had grown from a shy, uncertain boy into a young man with purpose. His voice, beginning to deepen with adolescence, carried clearly as he delivered his carefully prepared remarks. My father once told me that true nobility isn't about titles or wealth, but about how we treat others and the difference we make in the world, he said, his poise remarkable for a 13-year-old addressing hundreds. That's why the scholarship program that bears his name is so important to our family. We want Ravenscroft to be a place that changes lives for the better, just as it changed ours. The documentary director nodded approvingly to his cameraman, capturing the moment when Timothy announced the expansion of the scholarship program to include international students and a new focus on environmental conservation research. As the formal proceedings concluded and the festivities continued into the evening, Itzel found a quiet moment to give Timothy the letter from Cambridge. His eyes widened as he read the invitation to attend a special summer program for gifted young historians, designed specifically for students interested in medieval studies. "They want me to come next summer," he exclaimed. "Professor Harrington says my questions about castle architecture show remarkable insight for someone so young. Do you think I can go, Mom?" "Of course," Itzel assured him. "Your father would be so proud of how you've embraced your heritage." Later that night, as lanterns illuminated the castle grounds and traditional music drifted through the air, Helena joined Itzel on the ramparts. Below them, Timothy was teaching Iris and her cousins a medieval dance he'd learned from the historical reenactors. "You've accomplished something remarkable here," Helena observed. "When I think of how close this place came to falling into Roderick's hands," she shuddered slightly. "He would have sold it off, piece by piece, the art, the artifacts, the land itself." "Sometimes I think about that too," Itzel admitted. "How differently things might have turned out if we'd given up, if we'd sold the cabin out of desperation. But you didn't," Helena reminded her. "You persevered. You found the truth." The truth had continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The investigation into Garrett's death had eventually uncovered evidence of tampering with his car's brake lines, though proving Roderick's direct involvement remained elusive. Additional fraud victims had come forward after the trial, extending Roderick's sentence by several years. And the castle archives had continued to yield historical treasures, including correspondence that shed new light on Tudor politics and medieval building techniques. The story ended where it had begun, with Itzel tucking both children into beds that once held medieval princes and princesses. Iris's room, adjacent to Itzel's chamber in the family wing, had been decorated with a celestial theme, with stars painted on the ceiling by a local artist. Timothy had insisted on keeping his tower room, though it had been modernized with proper heating and a desk where he could study his growing collection of history books. As she turned out the lights in Timothy's room, he asked the question that had started their journey 5 years earlier. "Mama, whose castle was this?" This time, Itzel had a different answer. She smiled and kissed his forehead, seeing in his face the perfect blend of Garrett's features and her own. "It belongs to everyone who loves it, sweetheart. To the people who built it stone by stone, to those who preserved it through centuries, to the community that surrounds it now, we're just the lucky ones who get to call it home." Timothy nodded thoughtfully. "I'm going to make sure it stays standing for another 800 years. "I believe you will," Itzel replied, knowing in her heart that her son understood the true value of his inheritance, not measured in dollars or pounds, but in history, responsibility, and the opportunity to make a difference. As she closed his door and walked through the quiet corridors of Ravenscroft Castle, Itzel paused at a window overlooking the valley. In the distance, the cabin, the gatehouse that had been her dollar inheritance, was visible in the moonlight, its restored roof and sturdy walls, a reminder of how far they had come. The final shot showed the castle at night, every window glowing with warm light, no longer a monument to the past, but a beacon of hope for the future, where a family that was mocked and scorned now reigned over their own private kingdom, not through arrogance or entitlement, but through stewardship and service, transforming an ancient legacy into a living gift for generations to come. And somewhere, Itzel liked to think, Garrett was watching over them, pleased that his final act of love had led his family home at last.